So, what I think is going to be the most beneficial use of our time is for us to read the article together. And so, I'm going to see how this works. I'm not saying I'm married to it, but all we're doing for this class in general was reading articles and having discussions. So, what I'm going to do is create a fun environment where I read the articles and provide my thoughts and hopefully help ground yours. I think it's going to be very beneficial. So today we're starting with this article by Marilyn Schatz from the University of Michigan that says the influence of language and socioeconomic status on children's understanding of false belief. So I want to give you a little background. There's a hypothesis called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which suggests that the languages we possess in our minds cause our thoughts. That is, if we don't have a word for something in our language, we don't have the ability to think about it. Now, this article is one of the first that I really like to share with my undergrads that tests this idea from a different perspective. So false beliefs are like when you believe something incorrectly, that's a false belief. And understanding that people have false beliefs, it is quite a milestone in cognition. It's not like every person, every child understands that other people have their own beliefs, let alone false beliefs. So what we're seeing here is that they're looking at language and socioeconomic status on children's false beliefs. What I'm interested in, why I chose this, was the language. Does language cause people to have greater cognitive abilities, the abilities that didn't exist? Now, with that in mind, let's step into the abstract. I'm just going to say, too, I opened the PDF with my Word and it converted it so I can type in it and things like that. So, Study 1 investigated whether differences in the lexical explicitness with which language expresses false belief influence children's performance on standard false belief tasks. Now, I just want to clear up some things. Lexical explicitness, word explicitness. Like, are there words that explicitly target, I'm going to guess, false beliefs? Preschoolers speaking languages with explicit terms, Turkish and Puerto Rican Spanish, were compared with preschoolers speaking languages without explicit terms, Brazilian Portuguese and English, on questions assessing false belief, understanding either specifically the think question or more generally the look for question, period. So that's probably a little confusing to you. It's not the best written article that I've assigned, but essentially what we see here is that there's 4 different languages. 2 of them, Turkish and Puerto Rican Spanish, have a word that means to falsely believe. Brazilian Portuguese and English do not. And they're going to assess if this impacts the think for question, the look for question. This is like a hidden object task, and we'll read more about it as we read through it. But like in an abstract, the authors often assume you have a little bit more knowledge than if you're if you're reading the whole article. So essentially, there are 4 languages. 2 of them share this false belief word, and 2 of them do not. Lexical explicitness influence responses to the think question only. We'll get into what that means, but that's like a different point. So we'll see what that means. That's a problem for us to solve. Study 2 replicated Study 1 with groups of both speakers differing in socioeconomic status. A local effect of explicitness was found again, as well as more general influence of SES. The findings are discussed with regard to possible relations among language, SES, and understanding of the mind. So I think the second study, which we're not going to read, looks at just SES in general and these false belief sort of words. It says Study 2 replicated Study 1 with groups of both speakers differing in socioeconomic status. So they're going to see if there's like an extra component of SES. Now, here's the thing to know about socioeconomic status and language is that when people are in a lower SES environment, kids generally have less fluency around them. Their parents are talking to them less, and thus they're going to develop the language abilities less well. So this is sort of like how poverty impacts the mind. So from this abstract alone, I can tell you that this article is going to show us some things. It's going to specifically show that language impacts children's abilities to understand if a person has a false belief or not. And then there's something with SES. We're not going to read that article. Let's get into the theory, right? Because behind this is a very simple idea that our languages we use construct our thoughts. And so let's dive into that. Let's see where this paper starts. Let's see where it goes. Let's see how it finishes, right? We can see the abstract and look at how much time I'm spending on thinking about it. Normally, these thoughts come through my mind. I just don't have to say them out loud, so they come 10, 20 times faster. But I don't mind showing you how I would read this article. Research on children's understanding of mind has resulted in a profusion of reports about the nature of and influences on the development of false belief understanding, a capacity considered central to mature social thought and behavior. Although one can question whether understanding of false belief should be taken as paradigmatic for an understanding of the mind. Whoa, huge word there. Although one can question whether understanding of false belief should be taken as central for an understanding of the mind, of the paradigm of the mind, part and parcel with the mind, essential to understanding the mind, essentially. Nonetheless, a focus on false belief understanding has dominated the field since Wimner and Perner in 1983 initiated research into the area by using an experimental task to show that preschoolers had difficulty predicting the actions of others on the basis of false belief states. Okay, so in 1983, a breakthrough happened, and we found that kids are not very good at understanding that others have false beliefs. So we're going to read more about that literature here in a moment. The original findings are remarkably robust. That means they're consistent. Despite studies reporting various factors that facilitate good performance on false belief tasks, children under the age of 4 years generally have trouble on tasks that require them to predict the thoughts or actions of others that are based on false beliefs. So false beliefs really hurt kids younger than 4 in understanding like their actions and thoughts. So when a false belief is thrown into the mix, they don't know what to do. They don't understand the concept that the beliefs we have can be wrong. And a close look at the findings reveal that there is by no means a ceiling effect on performance, even at age 4. Such robustness is compatible with suggestions that there is a universal cognitive development trajectory governing growth and false belief understanding. Obviously, cross-cultural research showing common age and start patterns of development would support a universal cognitive theory, and there is some such support. So wait, that was a lot, right? So, when I was reading, I'm like, what's going on? So I'm like, okay. They said most kids have a problem requiring them to predict the thoughts and actions of others. And there's by no means a ceiling effect. That means not everybody's performing perfectly well on this task. Right? So there's looking at the literature, and you find that most kids under 4 can't do this. And then they're like, hey, such robustness is compatible with suggestions that, right there, they're saying this piece of evidence is compatible with the theory that cognition is universal, that there are universal trends and trajectories coded probably in our DNA about learning, about engaging, about social processing. And then they're saying, let's examine if this is universal. Let's do some cross-cultural research here to examine if this actually is a universal cognitive pattern that fits with universal cognitive theory, which is the idea that we all develop certain cognitive processes at roughly the same time. One cognitive capacity that has been tied to false belief understanding is language. Various language abilities, such as vocabulary size and use of certain syntactic structures, have been shown to be related to understanding of mind. Have family talk about mental states and bilingualism. I'm not going to read all the authors. So wait, let's go there. Various language abilities, such as vocabulary size and use of certain syntaxes, are related with better understanding of others' minds. Having family that talk about mental states helps us understand others' minds, and being bilingual helps understand others' minds, likely because you're dealing with two different meaning systems. Despite the tantalizing data indicating a relation between language and false belief understanding, the nature of the relations remains unclear. That's a scientific throwdown. We don't know why this happens. We need to figure it out. Thus, further exploration of the role of language is warranted, especially with regard to any influence cross-linguistic differences may have in the development of such understanding. So there they're saying we need to figure out why it exists, right? We need to do that scientifically. But let's look across languages. If this exists, if the ability of a language structure to improve one's ability to understand someone else's mind exists, we'll find it cross-culturally in research examining language. More particularly, we asked whether differences in the lexical explicitness with which languages express false belief might influence children's ability to pass false belief tasks. All that's saying is languages with clear words that define false belief may lead kids to be better at these false beliefs tasks. Examining the possible influence of lexical explicitness within only one language, Lee, Olson, and Torrance found that Chinese-speaking preschoolers did better on a false belief task when the mental verb used in the task explicitly connotated false belief that when the verb had a neutral connotation as to the truth of the belief. That was, I'm not going to lie, that sentence threw me there. But what they're saying is that there's been research done within monocultural research where Chinese-speaking preschooler kids do better on a false belief task when a specific verb is used that helps them tag something as a false belief. We instead, so they're saying this research existed in the past, we instead explored the issue cross-linguistically with speakers of 4 different languages. So what they're saying there is previously in that previous study, we know that when different words are used on a test or on a paper, on a psychological experiment, these different words can cause kids to do better at understanding mental states. Now, what they're saying is, like, if this can happen in a lab situation, does it happen cross-culturally where different languages are chronically used? So that's where they're pivoting. So despite the tantalizing data indicating a relation between language and false belief understanding, the nature of this relation remains unclear. Thus, further exploration of the role of language is warranted, especially cut. So, they're saying, hey, this is what we're going to do differently. We instead explored the issue cross-linguistically with speakers of 4 different languages. Would the glimmers of understanding that English-speaking 3-year-olds show in modified tasks be more developed in same-age children whose native language have linguistic means of encoding false belief more explicitly? And would they be developed enough that such children could pass standard false belief tasks earlier than children without such terms in their language? So what they're saying there is like, hey, would the evidence that we see in these experiments, would it actually translate to a wild idea that students that have different languages that connote false belief, that define and point out false belief, are they going to be able to pass to false belief tasks earlier than 4 years old? That's the question. Can young kids who have a false belief language actually develop theory of mind earlier? Theory of mind, the understanding that other people can have false beliefs, that's part of theory of mind. Or, despite language differences in the lexical explicitness or expressing false belief, would the difficulties young children experience with false belief tasks persist across groups speaking different native languages? That's an important question. Maybe they're saying, hey, maybe this has nothing to do with the languages they use. Maybe it's just developmental. To address these questions, we examine the performance on false belief tasks of 3 and 4-year-old monolingual native speakers. That just means only one language of 4 languages. We've seen this. It's going to be Turkish and Puerto Rican Spanish. It's going to be versus Brazilian and English. Let's read about this. Turkish and Puerto Rican Spanish have ways to mark false belief states explicitly with specific verbal forms, whereas the other 2 languages have no such specific form. If the native speakers of Turkish and PR Spanish were to do better on the false belief task, that would be evidence against the idea that there is a universal cognitive limitation on their early understanding of false beliefs, and in favor of the idea that the lexical characteristics of languages can influence performance on this cognitive task, at least with regards to the age at which such a cognitive limitation may be overcome. Right there, they're starting to put themselves in a classic debate. Are we made by our environment, or are we born a specific way? This is the nature and nurture debate, but specifically for language. You're saying, hey, it's possible that this is all nature, but it's possible that this is all experience. Let's give this a test. Do kids who have chronic exposure to languages with false belief verbs, explicit false belief words, are they better at false belief tasks? In what follows, we briefly describe the relevant differences among the 4 languages, ask the questions that we investigated with speakers of these languages, and note which groups of speakers were used to address each of them. I love that writing move. This is one that my students very rarely use, but look, they're just transitioning. In what follows, we briefly describe the relevant differences among the 4 languages, ask the questions that we investigated with speakers of these languages, and note which groups of speakers were used to address each of them. So now we're basically at the end of the intro, right? We got an idea for the theory that's being tested. Is this nature? Is it nurture? We got an idea for the other aspect, the specific aspect of the theory being tested. Do the words we use impact our ability to understand other people's mental states? And we got a very specific question. Do kids that grow up in languages with false belief verbs, do they do better at these tasks? Even though, if you look at the literature, it basically says no one over 4 can do this very well. That's the intro right there. Okay? And you can see they didn't start with the beginning of time. They did start a little bit away from their question. They spent a little bit of time on nature and nurture, but if you notice, they're focusing on language as a tool to construct the mind. The varied expression of belief. Languages need to express a variety of meanings about belief with mental terms, but often the same term is used to convey more than one meaning. Consider the English word think, which is commonly used to report the performance of a mental action. I'm thinking about the weather. To report a belief when the speaker is neutral about the truth value of that belief. John thinks it will rain today. As well as to report a belief when the speaker knows the belief is false. John thinks Richard Nixon is alive. Turkish and PR Spanish both have specific forms for making false beliefs. Turkish uses the verb san, a Turkish root, and zanet from the Arabic, with san reportedly being the preferred form among the younger generations. Do, is the verb form used when the speaker is neutral on truth value. And this form can also mean performing the mental activity of performing mental action. Like Puerto Rican Spanish, but unlike English, Brazilian Portuguese uses the verb pensar for performing mental action. Unlike Puerto Rican Spanish, but like English, Brazilian Portuguese uses only one verb construction for believing in either the neutral or false case, namely achar. However, unlike the English verb think, in certain syntactic constructions, achar can instead mean to find. See the appendix for a fuller description of how belief is encoded in each language. Table 1 summarizes the terms commonly used to express in the 4 languages the 3 meanings of engaging in the act of thinking, thinking neutrally with regard to truth value, and believing falsely. So let's just sort of kind of summarize what happened there. We just learned about these different languages. We learned 2 of them have specific verbs for false belief. And, we learned that there's kind of 3 meanings associated with the word think. The act of thinking, thinking neutrally with regard to the truth value. That means kind of like not being uncertain about truth, and believing falsely, right? So the act of engaging in thought, the act of being uncertain about others' thoughts, and believing something falsely, right? Those are the different conditions. It says there's an appendix. We can go look that out, but let's look at this table, right? So we got performing mental action. That's just thinking, right? So we can see that all 4 languages have a word for that. When we look at belief neutral, is it true? He thinks it's right. Is he right? I don't know. All languages have a word for that. In terms of false belief, right? All languages have a word for that. But now let's notice here, right? If we look at English, there's only one word. If we look at Brazilian Portuguese, there's two words. If we look at Puerto Rican Spanish, there are 3 different words. And if we look at Turkish, there are 3 different words. Now let's look at where those differences fall. So in Brazilian Portuguese, you do have a word that means to falsely believe, but it also means to be uncertain if something's true. So that's not a clear demarcation. Just like think doesn't help people learn. Achar doesn't help people see the difference. Like it could mean, oh, does he falsely believe or is he just uncertain? Or do they falsely believe or are they just uncertain? Now we look at Puerto Rican Spanish. We see a very similar situation, except creer se, right? You see that right there. There's a word that's derived from the belief neutral word, but it has a specific tag. So in this language, there's one word that everybody can look at, that a kid can use to say somebody else falsely believes that. And in Turkish, you have 2 words that connote false belief. Now, if you were living in a language, like think about being in these different languages as a kid. Like English, we're not really talking about our feelings and thoughts that much. And so you may not have that great of a grasp of it. You don't have words to say, oh, this is when you're thinking, this is when you're uncertain, this is when you falsely believe because you're a kid, right? You probably only have maybe this word for thinking. Maybe you barely understand it, right? So you're processing every mental process with the word think. You're viewing them as holistic. You're viewing them as the same. You go to Brazilian Portuguese, it's a little bit better, right? You understand that the act of think work, is different than believing thoughts of others or believing your thoughts of yourself. Right? You're going to get a little bit more experience and work with understanding mental states than English speakers are, right? But it's still not as good as when you move over to Puerto Rican Spanish and you got the word creer se that specifically points out hey, oh my, right? This is a false belief. That should facilitate learning in young children, right? Think about the 4-year-olds. We're not talking about 20-year-olds. We're talking about little guys, little cute kids, right? They don't necessarily have that many words. So if they do have multiple words for thinking, they should theoretically develop the ability to process others' mental states better. And then if you look at Turkish, you have multiple words that probably have nuances not described in this paper until we get to the appendix, right? Now, let's just go ahead and fly on through and sort of look at this appendix, there are examples in here. There's some various descriptions of what's going on. I'm honestly like, I'm not that into it where I want to know all these linguistic differences, but if you are, like, you need to be down here to read these little vignettes and stories and examples. But now we have an understanding of how the languages differ. I'm going back. We were just right at this. Oh, there we were, right? We understand how these languages differ, and now we're trying to figure out, well, okay, does experiencing these different languages impact one's ability to think about others? So, where was I? There we go. All right. Does explicit linguistic marking influence false belief understanding? So now I'm assuming we're going to get into some research and to some conjecture. The differences among these four languages allow us to investigate four questions about the relation between language and the understanding of mind. First, does having an explicit term for false believing in one's language improve performance on these false belief tasks? If so, other things being equal, Turkish and Puerto Rican Spanish speakers should do better than Brazilian Portuguese and English speakers. So that's their first prediction. Having a word should make you better at these false belief tasks. Second, how might lexical explicit forms for false belief help? On the one hand, they help by focusing the children on the representation of belief and encouraging them generally to reason about representations' relation to reality. Then Turkish and PR Spanish speakers in false belief context should do as well when asked a general question about false belief, e.g., where will X look for the Y? Has when asked an explicitly marked question, where does X think the object is? Let's hold on here, okay? That was interesting. They made one prediction that was super clear. We've already made it, and then they're like, "Oh, you got one I didn't really think of." Second, how might lexically explicit forms for false belief help? What might they do? They might be focusing children on the representation in their mind of belief, right? These words could help people that don't have any categories, that don't have any understanding of the world as we know it, develop categories for mental states. That's what they're arguing here. That's what these words mean. So, and they're also saying like the words help focus existing abilities. So if they help by focusing the children on representation of beliefs. So there's an understanding behind this that we have to develop representation of beliefs. And that was addressed in the first question. But behind that, we're talking about accessibility of these beliefs. And I didn't get it right off the bat. I'm not going to lie to you. I was like, wait, what's this mean? Right? So they're saying, hey, the words themselves can, which are just metaphors for feelings, right, can activate psychological processes that'll make you better in tune to other people's human experience. That's what they're arguing right there. Let's keep reading. And so then they say, then Turkish and PR Spanish speakers in false belief context should do as well when asked a general question about false belief, where will X look for the Y? Has when asked an explicitly marked question. So that's also weird, and it's because I'm reading it weird, whatever, but it says they will do as well in both conditions, right? These speakers will do as well if you ask them to think and look. Moreover, they should do as well on such questions when the speaker uses a neutral or unmarked form as when the marked form is used, because the mere existence of the marked form in the language would have previously facilitated their ability to consider a false representation, reality relation irrespective of the language used in any particular case. So that one's weird. They're basically just saying that, because they've used these representation structures in their lives, they should just generally be better. Because these languages would have facilitated a development of an understanding of others' mental states, as I was saying earlier. On the other hand, if the marked form helps only locally without influencing reasoning in a more general way, then the Turkish and Puerto Rican Spanish speakers should perform better when the marked form is actually used than when the neutral unmarked form is used or when a question lacking the explicit form is asked. Now, hidden in this jargon is an amazing hypothesis. And it actually goes nature-nurture. So, nurture, by using these language structures, folks that have these language structures should do better independent of how the question is asked. Nurture, the idea that the environment impacts our behavior. Well, here it's like how the question is asked should impact the performance of Puerto Rican Spanish speakers and Turkish speakers. So if the ability only exists when using the language itself carries the intelligence. So this is actually a really high order thought. When I talk about culture in class, I'm talking about it like it exists past my death, it existed before my life, and it formed me, right? Well, here we have a very interesting test of this idea. Can just the very words that we use it's the words that we use that cause the change in our psychological processes. The power is in the words. So either the power is in the consistent experience and how the words construct, an ability to understand other people's minds, or the words themselves possess the advantage. And when anyone who uses the word uses it, they'll do better. Now, the only people that can use a word for false belief are those that speak Turkish and Puerto Rican Spanish in this study. But essentially, it's a very important question. Is this just a local effect? That doesn't mean local in terms of the location where the study was done. Does this effect only impact the user when they are using the word, or is it long-term due to exposure in their language? Are their thoughts being shaped by their cultural structures, or are their thoughts only being shaped by these cultural structures when they're using them? Those are two different questions. And they're both really interesting. They both have very interesting implications. All right. Third, do the two kinds of marking for false belief, main verb in Turkish, and addition of the clitique in Puerto Rican Spanish. So now I'm like looking at this. I'm like right here. It's like san and zanet versus career and career say. So now I'm going to make an inference there that a clitique is that little say part. So if so, there should be no differences between Turkish and PR Spanish speakers. However, if one kind of marking is more discernible or salient than the other, then we would expect differences between the two groups of speakers. That basic question is just saying, is San and Zanet, are they better than Quirce? Are they better at creating this belief than Quirce? That's their third hypothesis, and they're not taking a stance on it. Fourth, does the differential polysemia think terms in Brazilian Portuguese and English influence performance? In particular, perhaps, so wait, let's talk about that. Polysemy, multiple words, right? Literally, we got English, one word. We got Brazilian Portuguese, two words. They're saying is just the act of using multiple, and I haven't finished reading the paragraph, but just the act of reading, having multiple words for similar ideas, does that improve performance on decoding other people's thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and whatever? So I read that first sentence. Let's get into their words. In particular, perhaps the Brazilian Portuguese speakers hearing achar may, under some circumstances, can carry the factive meaning of to find, may be negatively influenced by that term's potential to carry such a meaning, especially if they are asked a general look for question before the achar question. Hence, their responses might be sensitive to question order, whereas the responses of English speakers hearing think without such a potential for polysemy would show no sensitivity to question order. So that was weird. They're just basically saying what I said, but it's kind of not my favorite wording of it. But if you use the same word always, you're not going to be affected by order effects or how the questions are worded. You're not going to be impacted by how the questions are worded because they're all going to be worded the same. Do you think this? Do you think that? In study 1, we present data relevant to all 4 of these questions, with each data set making use of the same set of tasks but different combinations of participants. First, we use speakers of all 4 languages to address questions 1 and 2. And then we use speakers of Turkish and PR Spanish to provide more evidence regarding question 2 and also to address question 3. This is a poor writing move right here. I don't remember the questions. I know in general what they are, but it's like, yes, you said it once, they're just going on to that, telling you what they're going to do. I'm not going to finish that paragraph. It's not giving me any time. And I want to show you things like that. When I hit a paragraph like that, I'm not reading it. What I'm going to do instead is think big. This study, is kind of hard to see the beauty in it. But if you look close, you're really getting 2 major questions. Is your language that you use on a daily basis creating the abilities, mental abilities in you when the language is not even present? That's an important question. Are your thoughts in mind, your abilities as a young child being constructed by the languages you use? So in general, if that were the case, we're going to expect Puerto Rican Spanish speakers and Turkish speakers to simply be better at these false belief tasks no matter how the questions are worded. Now, the other question, which I find very interesting, is the one, it's kind of hard to think about, but does the language create thoughts? The use of it create thoughts, not long-lasting thoughts, but in-the-moment thoughts. Now, think about why this is interesting. Our culture creates language. We use it, right? Our culture creates new language. We use it. Like when I was a kid, I remember the word bling bling became a thing, and it kind of meant like to show off, right? But it was a little bit different than the show off because it was like having fun with wealth, kind of bling bling. It even like sounds like your phone ringing. It's like it's like that thought, having fun with your wealth. Was it one I wasn't able to have before I heard that word and used it? Right? But even further on, when I'm using that word, even in just like one context, I'm watching that little Wayne video and I'm like bling bling and I'm singing along. Does that make me more capitalist? That would be an idea that comes to my mind. But here they're not studying that basic idea. I mean, well, they're studying the basic idea, but not that question. Their question is about understanding others' minds, which is more important to the human species than anything else. Now, do the words carry the intelligence, or do the words construct our intelligence, or do the words have no impact on our intelligence? Now, I'm going to give you a preview on one of those. This paper wouldn't have been written if there was no impact on our intelligence. I really don't think it would have been published. It's really hard to publish like null findings or false results. But inside this experiment, while we may not get it, is a core and beautiful question. Does using a language impact in the moment our thoughts, like instantaneously? And does using a language consistently create a greater capacity for processes that are likely the foundation of empathy, like understanding other people's minds? I'm going to end the video here because we're done with the intro, but like, this is some good stuff. I can't wait to see what this study comes out to be. And these will get better, but honestly, I want you to join me on this quest, right? Like I'm grateful for this opportunity because I wouldn't have had time to do this before. And honestly, I don't know how to lecture to you for this class. But I think it's important for you to see how interesting these poorly worded papers are. And I think you're right. You can innovate these and make them better. But like this question, does using a language, right? Does that create a thought in us in the moment that we use it? Giving the language the power over our own minds is a great question. Furthermore, does simply having a specific language impact my mind all the time? This is very important for languages that have gendered articles, right? Like I think about the applications of this. If you're in a this is a great example. So my family name, Drewensky, right? Dericki, Drewensky, like Polish, American, whatever. My grandmother, before my family left Poland after World War II, was Drewenská, right? Like literally the family name in Poland changes based on if it's a man who possesses it or if it's a woman. So for example, when my wife lived in Poland for a year and had our ID with our last name on it, was always like being questioned if it was fraudulent because it ended with an I, not an A. That's how gendered Polish society is. Does growing up in that society where everything's gendered make people more sexist, right? That's the question overall, just in general. Or is it only when they're using those language structures that they're more sexist because it's the language that's sexist, not the people? And I think that's the interesting question here. We'll find out soon. You knew why this was important, why it was interesting. And now it's on to the methods. We're going to figure out the engine of psychology. I find methods fascinating. Most of my students skip it because they don't understand what's going on. But I'm going to make sure we're not in that boat. So study 1 method participants. 230 children participated in this study. 113 3-year-olds who shouldn't be good at this task. Let's put that clear. And 117 4-year-olds with all those extra little criteria. When I read a methods, I'm looking for anything fishy. So what I'm noticing is you got about equal number of 3 and 4-year-olds. Why are they using 3 and 4-year-olds? They're looking at that jump, right? That's the point where kids generally can figure out the false belief tasks is after 4, but not before. There were 50 Turkish children, 60 Puerto Rican children, 60 Brazilian children, and 60 American children. You can tell they tried to get a really balanced design, so they're doing good work. 23 of the Turkish children were 3-year-olds, and I skipped some stuff there. Nothing's really freaking me out. When you look at that, they have, from Midwestern sitters. Why'd they ignore other places? Because they're not from there. But also, that's actually a good thing because Midwesterners are the most weird, Western, educated, industrialized. I forget the other two, but like Westernized of the United States. The Midwest is the most isolated, and it's the most like independent in terms of behaviors when we measure them psychologically. Not necessarily in terms of like state motto or anything like that. I would say Texas is probably the most independent culturally in terms of shared culture. But when you look at it psychologically, Midwestern kids are the most individualized, which is what we're looking for. They're the most isolated. They're the most, they're the paradigmatic. That means they're the like prime example. They're the when someone says the word paradigmatic, that means they're of the paradigm. Western, if we're looking at Western English speaking people, the best sample we can have is Midwesterners, right? From a cross cultural perspective, not the you know what I mean. And so like I'm looking at that, I don't see anything that's making me flinch. If I do, I'll let you know. 23 of the Turkish children were 3-year-olds. The remaining 3 language groups were split evenly between the 2 age groups. I'm like, oh, what'd they do wrong there? They did a study internationally. I'm going to give them some leeway because I've done studies and I'm like, ooh, to coordinate across this many places and to only have these few little errors, this is pretty legit. Preliminary analysis on each of the 2 age groups revealed no differences in age among the language groups. So that's just saying both language groups have the same number of people of each age. That doesn't worry me as it might worry you because I know there's statistical methods to deal with unequal sample size. Brazilian children attended a private school and were of upper middle class SES, and the American children were drawn from a state university affiliated preschool and a private preschool and were mostly of upper middle class SES. So, did I miss? Oh, yeah, I totally did. Of all of the children were native monolingual speakers of their respective languages and attended preschool in their respective countries. To avoid possible differences that were due not to language but to socioeconomic differences, we limited our choices of preschool either to university-related or private ones in the hope that relatively homogeneous samples could be drawn from them. The Turkish children were drawn from 4 private preschools and were mostly of an upper middle class SES. The Puerto Rican children attended a state university affiliated preschool and ultimately were revealed to be more diverse in SES. And then I read this part. So you have 3 groups that are rich, 1 group that's not, essentially. And the question is, now if that Puerto Rican Spanish group ends up drastically different than the others, we don't know if the results are due to SES or if they're due to language experience. Now you can see there's a second study that's going to deal with that, which is great, right? And we saw that in the abstract and stuff, but now we see why. The reviewers saw this and were like, I think there's a problem there. But here's my question. They've talked about SES. I guess, yeah, the question is, well, why does it matter? Well, it's because in different SES status structures, your parents have more time to interact with you if you're rich. That's basically how it works down. If your parents interact with you more, then you develop better linguistically. Keep this in mind for when you have kids, right? And it's not just interacting with the kids more. It's also having tools to serve as language proxies for when you're not there. One of the big things about SES and reading is that low SES families don't have as many books for kids to read as high SES families. Low SES families don't have as many word games with all the pieces, so people don't play them. Like, it's not fun to play Scrabble if you don't have any A's. It's basically this, we don't have the money that most people have, and we now don't have the linguistic opportunities, which I think people forget. Like, people don't think of money in terms of parental time or educational tools or things like that, right? So, it is important to consider SES in its relationship to language because we know that SES has a strong relationship with language in the literature. Now, that's not stated in this paper, but, I've picked that up through my 20 years. So, is there anything wrong with the methods? I don't think so, other than the SES thing. And they're going to address that in a second study. So, I think the most important thing for those of us that read a study is a lot of us are like, my teachers expect me to be perfect on my labs. Well, that's 1, not true. But 2, you can't just destroy a study because they have 1 problem. This is 1 tiny problem. Let's look at the data. If Puerto Rican Spanish is the only group that's different, then we'll rerun the analysis and examine SES. If it's not, right, we can relax and see if the Turkish group holds out too. So this is, if the Turkish and the Puerto Rican Spanish group show up differently than the other 2 groups, that's pretty good evidence. So let's see what our design was. The study was designed to allow for 3 comparisons, which each one using a subset of the participants. There's a table for this. I'm going to look at that table. All right, so I'm not going to look at it yet. The first comparison involved 118 children from the 4 language groups in a 2, age, 3 or 4. I think there should be an X there. By 4. languages: Turkish, PR Spanish, Puerto Rican Spanish, Brazilian Portuguese, and English. I really hate that this paper just abbreviated historic group names. That's a thing that bothers Dr. D. It's nothing that affects the evidence, but when I write, I'm always, making sure I write out the groups. I'm making sure to show them respect. And, what you notice is that Puerto Rican and Brazilian were abbreviated, but English wasn't, Turkish wasn't. Like, just be consistent. So then it says between groups design. So this is, sorry about that. So this is a 2x4 between groups design. That means there's two independent variables. That's not what the number 2 means, though. I'm seeing that there's a number. There's one number 2 and there's one number 4. That means there's 2 independent variables, which is great. And for each variable, there are 2 and 4 conditions. So the 2 condition is the one I'm expecting, 3 and 4 year olds, and the 4 condition is another one I'm expecting, the language conditions. So this is an age by language condition experiment. So there's 2 ages, 3 and 4 year olds. Why does that matter? Because we expect 4 year olds to be able to do this task and 3 year olds not to be able to do this task. So in many ways, when we look at the language groups, which we already know really well, I'm looking at that 3-year-old condition for the advantage. I'm expecting Turkish 3-year-olds, Puerto Rican Spanish 3-year-olds to be superior because of their language. At least worst case when they're using their language, best case during the whole time. I mean, for their hypotheses. I always think what's the best case and worst case scenario for their hypotheses. Now, they stated their hypotheses pretty weakly, so I'm just going to pin on them the idea that they are predicting a long-lasting effect, even though it could be they're just predicting an in-the-moment effect. And remember, that's what we're after. We're after, if that long-term effect exists, it suggests that the language patterns your thoughts all the time. If it's only short term, it suggests that the intelligence lies in the language you use. The ability to think lies in the language you use. In many cases, this guy over here on the other end of this video chat kind of hopes that it works out so that it's just when they're using the language. And I know what's going to happen too. I've read this before, but I don't remember all the details, but if they only find that effect where it's only when the kids are using the language that they have the false belief advantage, they're not gonna see why it's important. The important part here for me as a cultural psychologist is that the language, when you use it, takes an instantaneous control of your mind and your cognitive abilities. I think that's the important part here, right? Does it pattern our world all the time, which is a very important question? Or, for me, getting at mechanism, right? The thoughts are held inside the language, and the language, you take it, it's like taking a pill, and it turns you into something else, okay? So let's keep going here. The purpose of this comparison was to test for the effect of explicit language marking of false belief on children's performance in false belief tasks by comparing languages with marking. Same thing as we did before, and without marking for sure. For this comparison, we plan to use 27 Turkish speakers and 31 Puerto Rican Spanish speakers who heard in the task protocols the verbal forms marked for self-belief in their respective languages, and 60 Brazilian Portuguese and English speakers, 15 in each age language group, who heard the same false belief questions in the same order as the Turkish and PR Spanish speakers. Now, that last part makes no sense. I'm not going to lie to you. There's been other points in this paper where I've been lost and I could figure it out. This one is literally just saying they're planning on doing some analysis and stuff. Maybe it makes no sense because they're talking about stuff I already know. But they're also talking about stuff I don't know. I haven't seen the methods yet. I don't know exactly what the methods are. And so it's really hard. They're talking like I know the methods. And that's frustrating to me. We can improve on this paper. I think it's a great paper. If Shatz and them are listening to me, I think it's a great paper. I think it's good. Don't be offended. But like, come on. Like, we could improve the language for my undergrads to understand what's going on. This isn't very easy to follow. Now, the good news is when I say write a paper for me, this is the A plus level. So look at all the mistakes linguistically this paper is making, construction wise, things like that. Like, it's still an A plus paper. So let me move on. The second comparison involved all the 110 of the Turkish and PR Spanish speaking children in a 2 by 2 by 2 condition. Let's read that out. 2 is the age groups, which we understand. Condition is the marked or unmarked. That's the language. That's the condition I'm interested in. Like, when you have the language that has the tool versus when you don't. By 2, languages Turkish or PR Spanish. So let me view this statistically. I'm kind of a statistical nerd. 2 and 3 and 4 make sense. That's always going to be there. Marked and unmarked makes sense. And then the languages, okay, they all make sense. All those things make sense statistically. No big deal. What you're noticing there is they're taking their whole data set and they're doing smaller comparisons. This one allows us to address the question, does having, more linguistic tuners, those different words for the idea, does having more affect the responses? So remember, Turkish had 2, Puerto Rican Spanish had 1. The purpose of this comparison was to use within language comparisons to explore the generality of any effect of explicit marking or false belief on the children's performance, as well as to examine the relative value of main verb and clitique markings. So they have a few things they're looking at there. Like, these are the ones that are kind of interesting. The clitique versus just the verbs, that doesn't affect me. Ignore my cat. I'll let her out here in a second. I got the door closed. She doesn't like that. All right, Rosie, there you go. Sorry about that, y'all. So when I'm looking at this comparison, it's like they're looking at the clitique and the verb. I'm less interested in that. The standard forms for false belief. There you go. Yeah, we got that. The conditions differed only in the versions of verbal forms used. The standard forms for false belief in Turkish and PR Spanish, respectively, were used in the marked condition. The neutral forms were used in the unmarked condition. So now they got the neutral form. They explained that to you before. Like, I think I might know that. That's the neutral form versus the false belief form. And they're going to compare those two to each other. So, these are the 2 different conditions they use. Remember, this is super important, and I know, like, even I'm like, let's get through this, Brian, right? I'm with you, but, like, we have to make sure we cover this. This is super important because it allows us to examine, right, the marked and unmarked condition. That allows us to examine if we don't find that cultural effect on its own. Do we find that cultural effect in the language itself? So it's sort of like personality versus the person versus situation debate, right? If the language constructs your person, you'll see this all the time. If the language provides a situation that constructs your thoughts in the situation, then you'll see a difference in the marked and unmarked conditions. So you just saw my computer screen probably go into the safe mode there because I've been reading for a while. But yeah, so just to reorganize ourselves, is there an effect always? You will see that across any way they ask the question. Is there an effect of language? Does language hold the intelligence? You will see it in the marked versus unmarked condition comparisons. 12 3-year-old and 15 4-year-old Turkish speakers and 16 3-year-old and 15 4-year-old Puerto Rican Spanish speakers were randomly assigned to the marked condition. 11 3-year-old and 12 4-year-old Turkish speakers and 14 3-year-old and 15 4-year-old Puerto Rican Spanish speakers were randomly assigned to the unmarked condition. I'm just going to say something right now. Statistically, those sample sizes are too small to make accurate predictions, in my opinion. You can make decent predictions, but I'm just saying, like, when you run a study these days, this would not be acceptable. This is published in one of the best journals in the world, but, you know, it's an APA journal, essentially, but this just wouldn't be acceptable in modern times because you have 15 people per condition. To have adequate power, I'm running a study right now, and I have 70 participants in each condition. Right? So literally, to make conclusions, I think the sample size is a little small, but it was a different time. If you look back at the time when this was published, like 10, 15 years ago, and you look at my research, I also had small sample sizes. You live, you learn, but I want you to know that one. The third comparison involved 12 Brazilian Portuguese and English-speaking children in a 2 age, which we expect, by 2 order. Think question first or think question second, by 2 languages that they spoke. That makes sense, between subjects design. So let's go over that. So they threw in an order condition, and they're going to ask the think question first, or the think question second. Now, they haven't told us the method yet, and this is frustrating me with this paper. To me, this is the biggest flaw with this paper, is how they expect me to know the method. So now I got to translate for you from what I've read already. So they're going to ask people, where does Snoopy think the crayons are? And you'll see that method in a second. And they're going to ask them, where does Snoopy look for the crayons? Those are 2 different questions, right? The thinking questions should tune you into the linguistic tools, and the look questions allow people to see if this just impacts their global understanding of others' thoughts. So let me just take a moment back here. If you find the cross-cultural differences in the look, not think condition, we know that language is patterning the construction of our thoughts and the use of our mind to understand others' emotions. If we only find it in the think question condition, we know that the language is holding the knowledge, and that it's almost like we're being processed through the language. The language is like taking a pill. We take it and we get better at false belief detection because the language is better at false belief detection. It's like taking cold medicine. Oh, my sniffles got reduced. Oh, I took the language, and now my ability to understand others' thoughts are present when the language is made for that. So if that doesn't make sense, shoot me a text in this apocalyptic times that we're living in, and we'll figure it out. I do gotta laugh. Some of this stuff just seems non-important. If you're sick right now, just take a break and relax. This will be here forever. I do think this is a good way to teach y'all how to read, because I know you struggle with that. Look at how long it's taking me. It's taking me this long to get through these sections, and you're like, it's because you're teaching. And I'm like, no, this is how I read these papers all the time. I just now have somebody to talk to about it. So, you know, I'm making sure we all understand that. Now the task and materials. Thank God we are here. Let's see what they did. Oh, this is so frustrating. There were 2 moved objects. There were 2 moved object tasks and 2 surprise contents tasks, similar to those used in classic false belief research. Great. We've never read any of that. Please tell us what this is. The moved object tasks were presented via storybooks with line drawings of the characters and objects. Fine. I don't mind. Use books. Cool. Each story involved a placement, unbeknownst to the main character, of a familiar object, a juice box that was removed from the refrigerator and placed elsewhere, and a ball that had been moved from under a chair and rolled under a bed. Let's just take a break. If you are a kid and you remember the juice box being in the fridge, that's where you're going to look. But if your brother took it and put it in the cooler, you're not going to look in the cooler. So one of the things they're going to look for is does expressing these ideas in different languages, does that lead to an improvement on folks saying, look in the refrigerator after they know that the brother moved it to the cooler? Because here's the problem with kids. Here's what we know. Like when kids see something, on, like, in example, like if kids are in the fridge and see the brother take the juice box out and put it in the cooler, they're going to think everybody else has that knowledge. So this is where it gets interesting. This is where you begin to be able to test those ideas, right? Do people look in the fridge versus the cooler? Do people look in the original place that it was because they have are you going to predict that other people are going to look in the place that it was because they don't have the knowledge that you have that the object was moved? And remember, we're dealing with 3 and 4 year olds. You're like, oh, I can do that. Yes, of course you can do that. But talk to a 3 and 4 year old, it's fun. It's fun to see how much more advanced we are psychologically than 3 and 4 year olds, which is a small thing to brag about, but it's fun. They don't get it, and it's cute because we understand it, right? You ask a little 3-year old, and he's like, so okay, the brother moved it to the cooler, so the other brother, he'll also look in the cooler because that's where the juice box is. and there's no realization that, oh, the brother wasn't here, and the second brother wasn't here, didn't learn that the juice box was moved, right? Like that's what we're getting at. Each story involved the placement, unbeknownst to the main character, of a familiar object, a juice box that was removed from the refrigerator and placed elsewhere, and a ball that had been moved from under a chair and rolled under a bed. One surprise context task involved a clearly identifiable crayon box and an equally sized and shaped box covered in solid blue paper. The other involved a clearly identifiable Lego box and an equally sized and shaped box covered in solid pink paper. Crayon and Lego boxes had been selected because the researchers native to participants' countries judged them to be familiar to children from these countries. Now let's hold on. They're saying this is unclear. They're saying they're going to put different things in the crayon and Lego boxes and see if the kids look there because they should, right? If your evil sister comes in and takes out like your Legos and puts in like, I don't know, rotten candy in there, something horrible that big sisters do, right? The kid's not going to know to like not look in the Lego box for their Legos. They're not going to know to not look in the Lego box for the crayons. So they do that and they find like rotten candy or dead spiders or whatever big sisters are doing these days. Sounds like the same it was when I was a kid, right? And then they're surprised. So they got a couple different tasks. They haven't described them well. Great. I described them for you. The order of presentation of tasks was the same for all children. First, the crayon box surprise contents task, then the juice and the ball moved objects task, and last, the Lego box surprise contents task. A single order was determined on the basis of pilot data, which revealed that it was easier to engage the children by starting with the moved objects task and ending the session with the Lego box task because the children wanted to continue to play with the Legos. So that's pretty cool because I was going to critique this and I was like, why don't you just do it randomly? Randomly's better. And they're like, people are people. Legos are dope. We all know it. I know you're watching Lego Masters. I am, right? Like, Legos are awesome. You give a kid Legos and try to take it away, you try finishing your experiment. So, some little minor flaws. Do any of them affect my trust in the study? No, I would have never assigned it to you if I thought it was bad, unless my whole goal was for you to see how bad it was, which I don't really do that often. We don't have that much time. So now let's get into the procedure where we're going to get more information. All children were given all 4 tasks. Children were seen individually by 2 experimenters in a single session. These are all details that I'm not really too keened in on, but you need them in there. Experimental 2, now let's label it E2 so we forget what that means, brought the child into a room where E1 was waiting. So now you got a tag team WWF experiment going on. You got 2 experimenters messing with kids. The child and experimenter 2 were invited to sit by the table to play some games. Would you like to play some games, child and experimenter? Oh, yes, we will. Experimenter 1 showed the child a bag. This is lots of things to play with. This is very creepy, but we're going to keep going. E1. Experimenter 1 then pulled out of the bag the crayon box and the blue box. Immediately, E2 touched the crayon box and said, that he or she wanted to draw with the crayons and was going to get some paper. So now experimenter 2 is being the person that's being like messed with. So E2 then left the room. E1 then asked the child, "What box do you think has the crayons in it?" Following the child's answer, E1 opened both boxes and remarked on the fact that the crayon box was empty, but the blue box contained the crayons. The child was then asked the following 2 questions. Where does E2 think the crayons are? Where is E2 going to look for the crayons when he or she returns to draw? So, false belief. To understand that people have a false belief, you have to understand they're going to look in the crayon box, not the blue box. And look, where does E2 think the crayons are? Where is E2 going to look for the crayons? Think versus look, right? And the think conditions have all those different language words in there. And so really, if this extends to the think question, great. We understand that, the language is impacting how people understand others. But if it extends to both questions, we know that the languages have a long-term patterning on other beliefs, right? On the processing of other people's mental states. In this case, false beliefs, but really the authors are interested in the whole kit and caboodle, right? Like all thoughts, that sort of thing. E2 then returned to the room and approached the table, pulled the crayon box toward him or her, and stated that she or he could not find the drawing papers in the other room. E2 went to the corner of the room facing the wall to look for the papers in their bag. The child was asked the following 2 questions. So now the experimenter comes in, and he's so close to playing with the crayons, but he or she cannot find, he, she, or they cannot find the crayons or the paper. So now they go look for paper, and we ask kids more questions. This is actually, like, in terms of psychology experiments, this one's well thought out. The ones with kids, you have to basically create like a mini soap opera that's obvious to everyone except for the little guys. And so you got these little guys sitting around a table like, what's going on? And they're so cute. And then they're asked, why did E2 pick or grab the crayon box? That's a good question. You're just going to allow the kids to answer that. And you're going to get a sense of what they know explicitly. Now, my guess is they're not going to know much explicitly because it's really hard to explain your thoughts when they're being processed by automatic processes. Kids aren't really doing everything consciously, right? They're learning implicit patterns and they're growing and they're doing things without knowing it, just like everybody else. So like this is allowing us to actually look at those processes. But my guess is this question was a waste of their time to ask. It'd be hard to figure out and sort of figure out what things mean. Question number 4, where are the crayons really? This question was asked as a reality check. The child was to tell E2 where the crayons were. When E2 returned to the table with the drawing papers, the child and E2 were then left to draw for a few minutes. So they're saying that they told the kid that part of it was for them to participate in helping out experimenter 2, but really don't forget the purpose. This is to get data from the kid. They're really checking, like, do the kids know what's going on, right? Like, I don't know what you'd make of this data, but for me, if they didn't know where the crayons were, the kids themselves didn't know, I'd just remove their data. And we're going to see they don't do that, I think, based on memory from a couple years ago when I read this last, and we'll see why. So after the child had drawn with crayons, I'm just going to call him E1. E1 pulled out of her bag. E1 must have always been a woman, is my guess. Or maybe they should have wrote there. I'd write there. Of their bag, a storybook with the moved object stories. After each story, the child was asked the 1 to 4. Okay, so once the experiment, this in-person experiment happened, they then did this same thing with stories, with the appropriate changes. They removed objects and not about which box held crayons. So basically now they're testing the idea again in 2 stories. So you got in person, you got in stories, same thing. You're still measuring the same 4 questions. When E1 finished getting answers to the story-related questions, she pulled out of her bag the Lego box and the pink box. At this point, the kid freaks out. But then experimenter 2 returned to the table, touched the Lego box, pulled it toward themselves, and told E1 that they were going to play with the Legos, but first had to clean up the papers and crayons and also look for some other Legos, right? So they again clearly show the kid what they believe. This is like 3-year-olds. They don't get anything. They're like little monsters wandering through this world that have no... It's almost like they're on the other side of Stranger Things, except we can see them. And so, they're wandering through there. The participants like, I'm going to look here for the Legos. And then they left the room and everything else was the same. You asked the kid the questions, all that stuff. Each participant heard only either a marked or unmarked version of the think questions in the set of questions described above. So half the participants heard the think questions. Oh, I'm sorry. For the think questions, half of them heard a marked language and half of them heard an unmarked. So half of the Turkish... So, for example, in the English sample, everybody heard an unmarked because unmarked doesn't exist. But in the Turkish example, half heard think in the think way and half heard think in the falsely think way. And so, there we go. For the unmarked version, I'm going to skip those details. I get what's going on here. Blah, blah, blah. These are details. Do I care? Let me skim them real quick. I'll just read it. For the unmarked version, the neutral verb not explicitly expressing false belief in Turkish and Puerto Rican Spanish, and the standard verb in Brazilian Portuguese and English were used in the think questions. For the marked version, the marked verb that expresses false belief. Blah, blah, I got that. Each participant heard only one order of questions, the think version first, in which the think question preceded the look for question for each task, was used throughout the first 2 comparisons, and for half the children in the third comparison. This is where it's like I need a table to figure out exactly everything that's going on here. And I don't care about this experiment that much to get into these weeds. These are weeds right here. We know what's being tested, right? Does language pattern one's thoughts all the time, right? Look questions or thought questions. Does language contain the intelligence in it? And when you use it, it's like taking a pill. And do you only show these advantages when you're using the false belief verbs? You got some other minor questions out here that aren't as important to me, right? The order question, that's the order question I'm not even going to get into because I'm not that interested in it. However, you know what I am interested in? Kids. And I don't mean that in the weird...
We're gonna have a tea party with Play-Doh. I wanna serve myself. Here, Sarah. No!
Well, you've probably discovered that however smart your 3-year-old is, she doesn't seem able to put herself in someone else's mental shoes, to imagine how they think and what they believe. Perhaps you thought your parenting skills were to blame, but scientists suggest that understanding other minds is a skill that may not be fully developed until a child is about 4. To learn how children's social skills evolve between about 3 and 4, researchers use something called a false belief test. What do you think's in this box? Looks fairly obvious, doesn't it?
Crayons.
Let me show you. I filled it full of candles.
No way.
Right, now I close it up again. While you and I have been having this conversation, Snoopy has been down here, asleep. Doesn't know what we've talked about. But let's bring him into the conversation. Now I have another question for you. What do you think Snoopy will say if I ask him what's in this box?
If I'm a typical 3-year-old, I'll say
Obviously.
candles. I'll say candles if I'm a 3-year-old.
What else could anybody possibly say?
Candles.
Well, watch this 3-year-old.
What do you think is inside this box? Okay, let's open it up and see.
Candles.
Now, you can ask the child what appears to be a very simple question about that. What did you think was inside the box when you first saw it? They say, oh, I always thought that there were candles in this box. Then you can ask them about someone else. So you can ask them about Snoopy. Snoopy's been sitting here. He hasn't seen this box. He's never seen us open it up. What does Snoopy think is inside this box?
Candles.
You can say the same thing. Snoopy will think there are candles inside this box. And what that indicates is that the children's view of how minds work is very, very different from the view that you and I would have. Yes. Did you see it?
In the mind of the 3-year-old, everyone sees the world much the same way. There's no difference between what I think and believe and what everyone else, including Snoopy, thinks and believes. It is, in a sense, a naive and innocent view of the world, a kind of mental Eden.
Or selfishness.
And then, about 4, comes the fall from grace.
Now, if you take the 4-year-old, quite typically the 4-year-old will tell you that, as a matter of fact, he thought there were crayons in the box. And then he found out that there were candles in the box. You can ask him about Snoopy, and he'll say, oh, no, Snoopy will think that there are crayons in this box. Great. Why will he think that?
Because it's a crayon box.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And that's going to make him think they're crayons. What's really in the box?
Candles.
And then you get
This
the
one
5-year-olds
gets
who are
it.
just utterly blasé and
Harvard.
think that this is such an obvious thing, it's silly even to ask the question. What that shows is that by the time children are 4 and 5, they have a view of the mind that looks much more like our view of the mind. They understand that things can be tricky and deceptive, that you can change your mind, that things aren't always the way that they seem. And that gives them a very different vision of how the mind works and how people work.
Remember, we're sharing this. Oh, I need that. Okay, then it's my turn.
Children who pass the false belief test now understand that other people can have different beliefs, even mistaken beliefs. Some scientists suggest that this test is further evidence of innate brain circuits specialized for reading other people's minds. They call it a theory of mind mechanism.
Results. So this is the part that freaks students out, and I'm going to decode it for you. Tell you how to deal with it with no stats knowledge. And I'll give you some stats knowledge. We begin with a preliminary analysis of the children's responses to question 4, which served as the reality check. We then present analysis of comparison 1 data, comparing the responses of children who speak a marked language and who heard such markings with those of children who speak an unmarked language. On first the think questions and then the look for questions, we next present for both of these questions the analyses of the comparison 2 data comparing the responses of Turkish and Puerto Rican Spanish speakers who heard the marked version of their language with those of those same speakers who heard the unmarked versions of their language. We also address here whether one sort of marking is preferred over another, or better, I'd say, instead of preferred. For comparison 3, we compare the performance of Brazilian, Portuguese, and English speakers who heard the think question first with the performance of those who heard it second. Finally, we present the data on children's explanations of their choices. Now, this whole first and second in the Brazilian, Portuguese, and English speakers, I think it's just, I don't think it's that relevant to the main questions. Maybe they found something in the future, but I'm not super interested in that. So now it's like, that was a bunch of junk. No wonder people stop reading my papers when I assign them. So let's just keep going. Let's move past that junky paragraph and move on to our next paragraph. Okay. We began our analysis by examining the children's responses to the last question in each task, which served as reality checks. Now, this question is important. For me, if kids actually did poorly on this question, I'm removing their data, which is going to be a hard sell for this group because it was hard to get their data across all these different contexts and countries. If children could not answer these questions adequately, we could not be sure how to interpret their answers on other questions with regard to their false belief understanding. Therefore, resolved to eliminate from further analyses any children who had not achieved a score of 3 or 4 on question number 4. You can go read up about that. Basically, it's did they know what was going on? We found that only 1/2 of all the Puerto Rican Spanish speakers achieved such a score, was 90% of all Turkish speakers, 92% of Brazilian Portuguese speakers, and 3/4 of all English speakers did so. That's actually a problem. 1/2. You're going to have to remove half your data. And don't interpret this one too closely. I just think the questions were probably poorly worded or the translation was difficult to follow. I think the authors are going to go into, oh, this sample had the most diverse SES, and I'm not a fan of that, right? I'm really not. If it's science, it's science. It just seems like an ad hoc, after the fact sort of trying to understand why this happened. But right now, if it's my data, I'm dropping the Puerto Rican Spanish group, or I'm figuring out what went wrong there, and I'm redoing that part of the study, because data is important, and this is clearly telling me something weird's going on. Let's see how they handled it. The relative frequencies of speakers eliminated were 30 Puerto Rican Spanish, 5 Turkish, 5 Brazilian Portuguese, and 15 English speakers. I might also have to remove my English condition, frankly. I don't know what's going on there either. Like, look at the other conditions. They're so much better. And so for me, if this were my study, I'm taking it and saying, like, look, I don't really trust the English data, and I don't really trust the Puerto Rican data either. I want to look at Turkish versus Portuguese in terms of these false belief knowledge systems. I get that they clearly told us they're going to keep these participants in there, which is fine as well. It's just going to make it more difficult to interpret the results. Like, we got to know, why are 1/4 of the English speakers not able to perceive reality? Why is 1/2 of the Puerto Rican Spanish speakers not able to correctly understand reality? Is it who ran the study? Is it how they ran the study? Is it where they ran the study? This, to me, as a scientist, is saying, hey, bro, stop, redo, cut these 2 conditions. Let's study one is just on these 2 conditions. But they clearly didn't do that. And then they're saying the relative frequencies eliminated were significantly different across languages. That means mathematically different. So it looks like they're different. It looks like they're drastically different. When we run stats on them, we find that math supports our intuition, right? We can intuitively see, yeah, there's a problem here. I didn't need to wait for this result. But then they add in here statistically, mathematically, that they're actually different. The Puerto Rican Spanish speakers might have done more poorly than the other speakers. What about the English speakers? Their experimenter noted that the strategic criterion of selecting a university-related preschool or a school in a middle to upper-class neighborhood to assure participant homogeneity in SES may have been less successful in Puerto Rico, because there has seemed to her to be considerable heterogeneity. That means... Okay, so heterogeneity means variance, differences in variance. Homogeneity means everyone's the same. Heterogeneity means variation in the data, variation in the SES in the university-related classroom. Following up on this observation, we solicited from the school's records information on the children's SES backgrounds. However, the only information available to us post hoc was the parental occupations of the pure Spanish speakers. Therefore, we adopted the following strategy. There's basically this whole index made from 1989 that codes the SES of parents' occupational prestige, and then they eliminated from further analysis all PR Spanish-speaking participants whose parental occupations were rated below 50% on this task. This left 17 children whose parents worked in jobs requiring more than 12 years of education or training in a trade, thereby likely making them more similar to the children in the other groups. Table 4 shows the numbers of participants by language, age, and condition who remained after elimination because of question 4 performance or SES, and whose data were used in statistical analysis in this section. We also conducted a subsequent study to address directly the question of SES. I didn't do that subsequent study. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm done reading this paper. Like, we're going to read this study and we're not going to read the second one. But it's like, to me, this is bad data fishing. Instead of saying, hey, look, I don't know what's going on here, I'm going to look for some, after the fact explanation that describes why this occurred. And they're like, oh, look, we think we found one, and now we're going to eliminate people based on SCS, even though we have no real theoretical basis for this. I mean, I was talking about it earlier a little bit, but to me, this is a slap in the face to science. I'm not a huge fan of this decision. And I understand we all have to make tough decisions in our work, but this one just seems gross to me. It's like, oh, like they didn't understand reality because poor people don't understand reality. Let's be real about what's being said. And I take offense to this because I grew up poor. I'm like, we understand reality better than you rich people. Right? Side note, not trying to create a war here. I'm just engaging with this thought about why I don't enjoy it. And like, here's the thing, like we all have our biases. I'm bringing my biases from my background into this experiment where other scientists may not view it this way. Well, coming from where I came from, I find this insulting. Also, coming from the University of Wisconsin-Madison as a grad program, I find the method decision insulting as well. Like, look, there's a problem in how you collected your data. Own it. Look at the two groups that matter. The Puerto Rican Spanish group. No, I'm sorry. The Turkish group and the Brazilian Portuguese group, right? Like, and hey, let's not talk about the American group. Why are they not being looked at for SES, right? How come this was only done for the Puerto Rican Spanish group, especially when the English group also did poorly? So I'm dropping both groups, honestly. Now let's get off my soapbox here and keep going. Comparison 1, marked for language analysis. Okay. So this is the question: marked or unmarked for language analysis. So we address whether there was any influence of the explicitly marking false beliefs in a language on children's performance on table 4. So that's table 4 right there. So you can see who ended up where. So we have 8. Oh, this is so unfortunate. We have 8 people in the Turkish marked condition, 8 3-year-olds. Oh, we have more than 8. Okay, we have 14 4-year-olds. Honestly, 4-year-olds already know how to do this task according to what we've seen in the previous research on the YouTube video. So for me, it's kind of unfortunate that you only have 8 3-year-olds in the marked condition. And only 11 in the unmarked condition. So really, that's one of the groups that's good, and we have different abilities to compare at the group that should do poorly. Remember, it's no big deal if 4-year-olds. I don't even know what it means if the 4-year-olds across the different language sets do better. But I do know what it means if the 3-year-olds do better. It means that the language factors are impacting their ability to perceive others' thoughts and emotions. And so now I'm looking at this and I'm like, ooh, I really wish they had more 3-year-olds, honestly. We look at the Puerto Rican Spanish group. You can see there, after they have very few people left, I would just eliminate all those data. The Brazilian Portuguese 3-year-olds versus the 4-year-olds, they got 14 and 12. I'm a little bit happier there. But I'm going to be, like, for me, when I'm looking at the data, I'm going to be comparing that group of 8, that group of 14, that group of 11, and that group of 12. To me, that's where the interesting comparison is happening, right? I don't care if 4-year-olds are better. I care if 3-year-olds are better based on these questions, right? Like, that's the question I want to answer. Like, I don't care what question they want to answer. I'm caring what question I want to answer based on this data. And that might sound arrogant, but this is the way scientists think. It's like, look, now I'm invested in this project. I just talked about how I'm thinking about it, right? I'm predicting that there are going to be differences in 3-year-olds, but I don't think there's going to be differences in 4-year-olds. And if there are, I have no idea how to interpret them. But now we can see all of those different groups and comparisons in table 4. False belief in language on children's performance on false belief task by analyzing first whether an effect was found on responses to questions directly asking about thinking, and then whether a more general effect was found on responses to the look for question. So let's talk about that too. The thinking and look for questions matter. Thinking is language is a pill. Language contains the thoughts. Language contains the knowledge, right? And looking is, did language pattern my complete mental processes so that I'm always thinking more in depth about other people's thoughts, feelings, and emotions. So those are those 2 components there. Table 5 presents the means on the think and look for questions for the participants remaining in each of the language age groups. Why did I skip subjects there? Because you're not rats. These kids are not rats. They're participants. In general, we shouldn't call people subjects. We should only use that for like rats and mice and fish. Because so few Puerto Rican Spanish speakers remained, we combined the data, of course you did, from Turkish and Puerto Rican Spanish speakers into a marked language condition on the data from the Brazilian Portuguese and English speakers into an unmarked language condition for the statistical analyses. So they said there's a table of means. I saw it earlier. I want to go down to those means, and I want to go see what I see here. So first things first, the only two groups that I trust are the Turkish groups and the Brazilian Portuguese groups. So I'm looking at those data. So I see let's just look at the marked question. Turkish 3-year-olds marked, they got 1.63 of the questions correct. So they're not getting many of them right. Overall there's 4. There's a high score of 4. And so they're getting less than half correctly. Turkish 3-year-olds are getting less than half. Let's look at the Brazilian 3-year-olds. And what you see there is that they are getting about 1/3 of a question less correct. 1.36, 1/3 of a question is about 0.36. And then also so I'm just looking at the data right now, and so I'm seeing, okay, that appears to be an increase. 1/3 of a question correct. 1/3 of one question correct. It doesn't seem like that much, right? But if you took a test with 100 questions, it's actually quite a bit more. So, there's a decent increase there. I'm not saying that these numbers are mathematically significant. I'm just looking at the data right now. One of the weird things I noticed was that in the unmarked condition, you got a little bit of an advantage. It's not much, but it's a little bit of an advantage. I doubt it's going to be a significant difference, but I do think in a larger study it would be. So there's some reason why, like in the Turkish group, you're getting that increase in the unmarked condition compared to the marked, while the marked condition should contain the knowledge. So I think that's a good. I think there's some evidence there to suggest that the language is patterning one's thought process independent of, how the words are used. Independent of the words, there appears to be an advantage. But let's go down and look at that Puerto Rican 3-year-old. And if you look in the unmarked condition, all right, this is the think and non-think. This is like the think and the falsely believe. Brazilian Portuguese 3-year-olds in the unmarked condition are actually doing substantially better than everyone else. And so, when I'm looking at this, I'm like, ooh, that's kind of interesting. That's an interesting pattern. Let's go ahead and look at Puerto Rican Spanish and English. So in Puerto Rican Spanish, you're looking at your 3-year-olds again. And you can see that there is an advantage in the unmarked condition. I literally am just confused right now, so I looked at made sure I was reading it correctly, and I'm correct. Number of correct responses on the think and look for questions by age, language, and condition in study. So in the think questions, right, we're seeing not really, unmarked condition, Puerto Rican Spanish is doing better in the unmarked condition, so that's going against all hypotheses that have been laid out here. The think question, marked and unmarked, is where the knowledge should be the most prevalent in determining thought processes of these kids. And it's in the 3-year-old group that we would expect to see the greatest sort of advances, and that's not what we're seeing In the English 3-year-olds, we're seeing an advantage of the they got a second question where they asked think question second. So yeah, let me go back to that Brazilian Portuguese data. Essentially, you don't have a marked or unmarked condition. You just have question 1 and question 2. And we got, on average, we average those together, and then we get about 1.63. So going back to that Turkish 3-year-old population in the marked and unmarked condition, they're really not performing any differently than the Brazilian Portuguese. And yes, I kind of messed that up. I misread. I forgot a little bit that Brazilian Portuguese doesn't have a marked and unmarked word. So like, essentially in these 3-year-olds, I'm not noticing any difference. And if I look at the English 3-year-olds, you got about the same 1.4 of an effect. First and second condition, and that 1.4 doesn't appear to be that much smaller than the 1.63 or the 1.50 in the marked conditions for Turkish and Puerto Rican Spanish. Right? So essentially, when I'm looking at this data for the 3-year-olds where the impact should happen, I'm not seeing anything. Now let's look at these 4-year-olds. And in this 4-year-old data, let's just look at the Turkish group. The marked condition does almost perfect. The unmarked condition gets a 50%. So it's like an 80% versus a 50%. Or 75 versus 50. That's quite a difference. So what we're seeing here, and this is not what was predicted, right? They didn't really come out there and state this, but the research shows that the shift happens from 3 to 4. So 4-year-olds know how to do this, 3-year-olds don't, is sort of the idea. And clearly we can see that in the Turkish group, the marked question substantially helps out after people have developed the ability. So like, I'm trying to figure out why this exists. And I'm saying, this goes back to developmental psychology. Once you learn a skill cognitively, it goes back and forth. It backtracks. It boomerangs, right? Like you have this skill today on one day, but I test you the next day, you don't. So it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So for the 4-year-olds, what I'm seeing is that the way the questions are asked drastically impact the way, and I'm just looking at these numbers right here, drastically impact their ability to think about, to correctly decipher other people's cognitive states. Let's see what happens in the Puerto Rican Spanish 4-year-olds. The same thing. Let's see what effects we get in the Brazilian Portuguese folks. And here you got question 1, question 2. You can see that people improve from question 1 to question 2, but not much. In the English group, you see a drastic improvement from question 1 to question 2. So you can see that that's just order. Which question do they get first or second? So kids generally do better on the second question because they understand what's going on after they've done the first. This is exactly what you experience when you take a test from a professor that gives tests, and then the second one you do better on because you've decoded their way of providing tests. So what I'm noticing here in this data is that for 4-year-olds that have the ability, that have the language in that have the words in their language to connote a false belief, and those that supposedly have the ability, but just barely developed it, just recently developed that ability, the language drastically helps their performance after they've developed the ability. Now, if you look here, what didn't I do? I didn't allow the authors to throw their interpretations on me. I'm looking at the data, and I'm saying, like, what I see in that data. And I'm just basing this on the patterns that I'm noticing. I don't have p-values involved with this. But this is always my first step. If I get a table like this of all the data, I'm going to look at it. I'm going to figure out what it means. And what I see here is that where I thought the effect would be in the 3-year-olds, that's not the case. And like, let's go back to, we'll look at the numbers in a second, but let's go back to the theory here, right? The idea that it would help 3-year-olds cross that developmental milestone into understanding false belief earlier. Well, we didn't find evidence for that. They didn't find evidence for that. But what it does show me is that in these young folks who just developed this ability, right? They have the ability to process others' thoughts. When they use the language, they get even more ability. So what I'm seeing here is a developmental milestone that appears to be universal. People develop the ability of theory of mind at about 4 years old. However, in the early stages of development of this ability, what we see is that the language can add additional intelligence that allows one to do even better. And we find this across particularly the marked and unmarked conditions of both Turkish and Puerto Rican Spanish. And so this one is evidence, not that the language creates the thought structures, but that the language holds the intelligence inside of them. When you're using that language structure, that marked language structure, you're almost twice as good. So inside, the intelligence isn't inside the individual. The language causes the individual to be more intelligent in terms of understanding what others are thinking. The language holds the intelligence here. To me, this is the more important sort of examination. If our language patterns our thoughts all the time, that's important to know. But what we see here is that when we use specific languages, our thoughts are taken over by the culture. That's what I'm seeing in this data. Question number 1 of the think question. A 2x2 repeated measures of ANOVA. Don't worry about that. For unequal samples, don't worry about that. Revealed a significant effect of age with so here's what we got, right? Boom, ignore, unless you want to look at it. 4-year-olds answered more think questions correctly than 3-year-olds. Boom. That's classic what we found in the previous literature. A marginal effective condition where p equals 0.05. So that's like, wasn't quite significant. It equal 0.05. But basically, I'm just going to interpret this one as significant. So, and no interaction effect. In fact, so they didn't tell me the marginal effect of condition. But that's going to be marked language versus unmarked language. So let me see here. Analysis against chance. I don't understand. Revealed that 3-year-olds in the unmarked condition correctly answered significantly fewer questions than expected by chance. So now they're doing some weird stats here. 3-year-olds in the unmarked condition correctly answered significantly fewer questions than expected by chance. 3-year-olds in the marked condition were correct at chance levels, and 4-year-olds in both the unmarked and marked conditions correctly answered above chance levels, respectively. I'm going to ignore the chances analysis. That's like, did they do worse than 50? If you had 2 options, did they do worse than 50-50? If you had 4 options, did they do worse than 1/4 out of 1/4, right? Just like, it's just basic testing strategy. But I don't understand what they're getting at there. In fact, analysis against chance revealed, and chance, they're saying chance was 2 out of 4, revealed that 3-year-olds in the unmarked condition correctly answered significantly fewer questions than expected by chance. Okay, so 3-year-olds are worse than chance. Three-year-olds in the marked condition were correct at chance levels. So marked brought the kids up to chance, unmarked kept the 3-year-olds at chance. But this isn't looking at the different language conditions that we were talking about. It's just like age by marked and, well, I guess it is looking at marked and unmarked, but it's not looking at the different languages. So this one is kind of like flustering me right now. So I can understand how students get flustered reading these articles. In fact, analyses against chance being 2, revealed that 3-year-olds in the unmarked condition correctly answered significantly fewer questions than expected by chance. 3-year-olds in the marked condition were at chance level. So when they combine everyone together, and they looked at marked and unmarked language usage for everyone, they see that marked in 3-year-olds led to an advantage over chance. And that 3-year-olds were substantially under chance. Well, 3-year-olds are substantially under chance in their answers. They're worse than chance would predict, right? But then when they have the marked condition, they're at chance. Okay. With no interaction between condition and an age, we combined it across ages, so they found no age effects. So now they're saying let's combine them together. I think that's wrong, right? Like of course you didn't find an interaction between condition and age. You didn't have enough participants to find an interaction between condition and age. So like here's now where like I'm starting to disagree with some of their choices statistically, and I'm pretty good at stats. So I'm not trying to be like, oh, I know better than them, but this is just weird to me. Yeah, finding the power to find an interaction, you need a lot more participants than what they have. So of course, whatever. I would run t-tests that compare the thing that I was talking about before, but don't worry about this. You don't need to understand stats. It revealed a significant effect of markedness. Speakers of the language explicitly marking false beliefs, Turkish and Bear Spanish, answered the think questions correctly. All right, so we left it a second ago by looking at all the data individually and making our own conclusions. Let's see how they process the data. And I'm going to tell you right now, they processed it differently than I would. So question number 1, the think question. A 2x2 repeated measures ANOVA for unequal sample sizes revealed a significant effect of age, with 4-year-olds answering more think questions correctly. Right there, if you don't know stats, it's cool. You just have to go in, 4-year-olds answered more think questions correctly than 3-year-olds. That's all you need to know. Just highlight that. That's what all that gibberish means. A marginal effect of condition and no interaction effect. Now, a marginal effect of condition just simply means that there was a difference, kind of, between the marked and unmarked languages on the think question. And you're probably seeing marginal. You're like, what's that mean? That means the P equals 0.05. It's not less than 0.05. That's it. I'm going to give it to them because I view that as significant. I do. If it's 0.05 or less, I view it as significant. Then it says, in fact, analysis. Then it says, and no. In fact, analyses against chance. Chance equals 2. There were 4 questions. How many of them did they get right by chance? They're saying that they should have got 2 correct. Yeah, I'm a little lost on why they didn't say chance should be 1 correct. So because they did it 4 different times. Oh, because it was 50-50 on each of the ones. So, like, okay, you got 4 questions. They're 50-50. You should get 2 correct. Okay. Revealed that 3-year-olds in the unmarked condition correctly answered significantly fewer questions than expected by chance. That 1.35 is different than 2. 3-year-olds in the marked condition were correct at chance levels. That 1.6 has now made it to mathematical chance level, even though it's barely different from 1.35. And 4-year-olds in both the unmarked and marked conditions correctly answered above chance, and they don't. Oh, yeah, 2.62 and 3.38 are both above chance. Now, I think that's a weird analysis. I don't think that matters. I do think the original analysis matters. They have an effective age where 3-year-olds were worse than 4-year-olds. We expected that. They did not have their interaction, right, which is definitely important. But they went ahead. Yeah, and they went ahead and did this chance analysis. I don't know, because this effect may not be there, honestly. Statistically, this isn't the way I would have analyzed this data. I'll just tell it to you that way. But right now, what do we know? We know 3-year-olds are worse than 4-year-olds overall. And then they're like, with no interaction between condition and age, we combined across ages and performed a one-way repeated measures ANOVA for unequal samples. So this is where I disagree. Remember what I said before, the effect when you look at the actual data, it appears to the language helps out those who have crossed the developmental threshold. That's what's going on with the data. This data now ignores that fact and just says, let's lump them all together. I don't agree with that decision. I really don't. I think it's a bad decision. But let's see what they find, and let's see if it changed my mind. It revealed a significant effect of markedness. Speakers of the language explicitly marking false belief answered the think questions correctly more often than did the speakers of unmarked languages, so forth. So they did that. They combined across ages, and they found their marked effect. You know why they found that marked effect? Not because they needed to collapse across ages, but because they needed to get more participants. Let's be real about it. Analyses against chance revealed that children in the marked condition performed significantly above chance, whereas children in the unmarked condition performed at chance levels. They added chance after the fact. I don't care about this chance analysis. That's not how they should analyze it. We also conducted a chi-square test on the number of children who got 3 to 4 think questions correctly. 71% of the children hearing marked forms in their language did so, compared with 37% of the children who speak unmarked languages. So this is actually kind of interesting. They're saying, okay, if you got 3 to 4 think questions correctly, you've pretty much mastered this task. 71% of children hearing marked forms were in this range, with only 30% of children who speak unmarked languages. I don't know what they mean there. On the number of children combined across ages who got 3 to 4 think questions correct, 71% of the children hearing marked forms in their languages did so. So this is comparing those who heard a marked form to just the children who speak unmarked languages. So the children who heard a marked verb did better than the combination of all children on their scores who hear no markings at all in their languages. So I want to go back to this graph here, and I want to show you what they did. They said, okay, let's combine all of these together and compare them against all of these. That's what they did. I'm sorry, let's add all these together. The marked condition, not versus the unmarked in their language, the marked condition versus this right here. So that's a weird comparison. It's just a weird comparison. That's not the one I would make. So what we learn there is that kids that speak marked languages get more correct than kids who have no word for marked languages. What I really want to know is, did kids who speak marked languages do better than those who speak unmarked languages, which I think they did get. Let me go back and look at the data and just see what they got here. So let's just go through this again because data's hard. So they got this complex analysis. There was an effective age. Boom. 3-year-olds are worse than 4-year-olds. Condition, there was an effective condition. I'm going to give it to them. They don't tell me that effect, but you can clearly see, and here's the problem. They didn't tell me the effective condition. I go back and I look at condition and I see, ooh, do they mean marked versus unmarked? Or do they mean marked versus unmarked versus everything else? So let me see here. Effective condition is one. So one of the things statistically that I looked at was the degrees of freedom here. And I told you didn't have to know much stats. You don't have to know this. But in an F statistic, you get the degrees of freedom across your different conditions and the degrees of freedom sort of across your participants. So this first number tells us the number of conditions minus 1. So what I'm getting there is that their conditions were marked versus unmarked. So that's how they viewed them. So what I can see there is clearly what I saw when I looked down at the data, that those in the marked condition do better than those in an unmarked condition. So super. No big deal. And then they got the chance analyses. I'm going to skip those because those don't really matter. Those were done after the fact. Then they combined everybody together. I think that's wrong. I think their interpretations of the data are going to be incorrect a little bit. I think the data is important. We looked at it, but their interpretations are going to be wrong. Revealed a significant effect of markedness. Speakers of the languages explicitly marking false beliefs. Answered the think questions correctly more often than speakers of unmarked languages. So we got markedness only in native speakers and unmarkedness only in native speakers. So they didn't allow for that comparison condition across Turkish marked and unmarked and Puerto Rican marked and unmarked. So that's where we ended it. They did this chi-squared analysis where they found that more children who speak unmarked languages did worse than children hearing the marked forms in their languages. So it's a really weird comparison. It's saying like, oh, combining all these kids right here into one group and comparing it versus this group right here. That's what they did. I don't agree with it. Neither should you. Okay, but that doesn't mean the data are horrible. It just means their analyses are kind of horrible. Question 2, the look for question. Now, this is the one that I think is very important. Do you see an impact when you're not using the word, right? Just like if you're using the words think and to falsely believe and you see an impact, that means that the impact is due to the language and the language carries the intelligence. If we don't find the impact in the look question, that means there's not a long-term effect of language. That means language isn't patterning our thoughts and our understanding of others all the time. It's only when we're using it. So this question, if we don't find anything, is very important. Let's look at it. The same complicated analysis conducted above was conducted here, but now with the look question, the dependent variable yielded only a main effect of age, with older children performing more correctly than younger children. Pause. The language does not pattern our thoughts all the time, only when we use it. That is a very useful analysis. I don't have to read the rest of it, I get it, but let me just read it for you and tell you what I think you should skip or not. The repeated measures of ANOVA combining across all ages on this question revealed no effective markedness, although 65% of children in the marked condition got 3 to 4 look for questions correct compared with 46% in the unmarked condition. This difference did not reach significance. This whole chance analysis thing is bullshit. I'm just going to call it what it is. It's bullshit. And so, like, you can see what they were predicting. You can tell right now. They don't want to let their data tell them this beautiful story that exists. They're just like, I'm looking for this one thing and it's not there. Let me look for it again. You know, I'm going to keep doing this every different way till I can find it. And even though it didn't reach significance, my p-value is 0.08. Take my stats class. You'll learn why this is crap too. But I'm not getting into that one today. And so now we're sort of at this situation where we do know a little bit. We know that language carries the intelligence. We know that because in the previous analysis, we knew that when they were using the language, they were better at predicting theory of mind and false beliefs. But when they're not using the language tools that carry the intelligence with them, they're no better than anyone else. They're trying to argue that they're better, but they're not. Right? That's because the language itself carries the intelligence, not the human. That's what their data are telling me. They clearly need more participants for me to be confident in this conclusion. So that's another thing too. It's like, man, how can I redo this? I actually want to redo this study. I think it's really cool. And I'm like, can I find Puerto Rican Spanish speakers? And can I find English-speaking speakers? I actually can in my hometown. I grew up with a lot of Puerto Rican Spanish speakers. I grew up with a lot of Puerto Ricans, right? Like, love it, right? Like, I'm like, hey, where can I find this in my world? Well, I can go back to Gary, Indiana, where I'm from, and I can set up shop at my, preschools, or set up shop at the grocery store, or anything like that. I can redo this analysis in a group of kids that are in the same neighborhood, right? This is where I grew up. everything else is the same. You're not across nations. You're not across SES patterns. A little bit, but you'll measure for that, but it won't be as drastic as in their work, right? From the same kids from the same neighborhood that have interaction with each other, that have the same understanding of the world. Differ on one thing, the language that they speak. So we're getting an idea for what's happening. Language doesn't pattern your thoughts all the time. It patterns your thoughts only when you use it. Language, not the people, has the intelligence inside of it. Now let's see what else they say. In sum, the analyses of comparison 1 revealed that children hearing the forms in their language is marked for false belief generally answered more correctly to questions with the term think than in children without such forms in their languages. Both their mean scores and their number of children performing at high level confirmed this finding. The lack of an interaction between age and condition revealed that this pattern of results tended to hold for both 3 and 4-year-olds. Really, it only held for 4-year-olds. Look at your own data. Importantly, there was no carryover from their high level of performance on that question to the more general look for question. Marking seemed to help the speakers of a marked language only locally, that is, to answer more correctly only those questions in which the actual marked form was used. They're telling you basically what I said before, but they're not going big, right? To go big here, these results suggest that the intelligence, cultural intelligence, is held in the language, not consistently or permanently held in the mind. Comparison to Turkish and Puerto Rican Spanish, 2 language analyses. I am not going to go here because they don't have enough data. I'm not even reading that. And I know if you want to, feel free, but I'm not reading it. They don't have enough data. It's not worth me looking at it. And I know you're like, wow, you're making that decision? Yeah, I am. I'm not going to read that one because I know they don't have enough people in it, so I don't care. Let's look at Portuguese and English order analyses. We can see those analyses. I don't really care about those. We can see what's going on. Look over here, right? First and second, first and second, first and second, first and second. With the exception of Brazilian 3-year-olds, right, where there appears to be a minor decrease in terms of order. Every other group shows a pretty good increase in terms of order. Well, with the exception of English 4-year-olds, but they're pretty high anyways. So in terms of order, maybe they're talking about look and think questions. My bad. So here we compare the performance of children who receive think questions either before or after look for questions. Why are they doing this? So the think questions can make you think about thinking on the look questions. The look questions cannot make you think about thinking on the think questions. So is there a difference in terms of their performance based on which one they got first, and what does it mean? Well, if there is a difference, we know that, let's say if you got the think questions first and then you showed an advantage in the look questions, we know that language has like a local effect that might have a little bit of a lasting residual response. Let's see what they found. Because in Brazilian Portuguese, the verb form think can also carry the meaning of find, Brazilian Portuguese speakers may perform worse than English speakers on the think find question, especially if hearing the look for question first primes a find interpretation. And so they're really saying this is a problem with their study. Let's see if it had an effect. Let's figure out what that means. An interaction between language and order would support this hypothesis. A 2 by 2 by 2 repeated measures ANOVA on uneven samples, blah, 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 with answers to the think question as a dependent variable yielded a main effect, with 4-year-olds producing more correct answers than 3-year-olds in a main effect of order, with children hearing the think question second performing better than those hearing that question first. So the kids were asked, where would Snoopy look for the crayons? When they asked the question in look, where does Snoopy look for the crayons? That only has one interpretation. And you see that allows our kids to do better in terms of looking for the data. right? So ultimately, let's take this out of their specific questions. And I think they're missing kind of some beautiful data here. The words you use in the language control your thoughts, your processes in the moment. I'm viewing it like computer code. It's like a start. It's a start code. It says start this process, right? It's a function. When they see that word, boom, all of a sudden a process starts in their mind. Right? When they see look, words like look make them think about where other people are looking for things, right? Like where other people are actually engaging in things. When they hear words like think, which could mean I don't know what they think, could mean like they don't know, right? Could mean a lot of things. We find worse performance. So when you ask the look question first, you're priming your participants to know what the end result is, and they're now thinking about where do people look for the answer, because that's what they're actually doing. So what the consistent pattern I see in this data, which I do honestly believe is poorly reported, sue me. I think this is a very bad data report. It's way too complicated. There's way too much crap in here. They were data fishing. But when we look at it, we can see a pattern of data that emerges despite their best efforts to hide it. You can see that when folks are using language structures, those language structures activate programs. Those language structures activate behaviors, activate cognitions, activate beliefs, activate knowledge. The knowledge is in the language, not in the human. You can see that again, even in this question right here. So the language doesn't pattern your thoughts all the time, but the language you use patterns the thoughts of others in the moment. The language holds the intelligence. How can you use this? Think about how you would use this information to ask a professor to get an extension. Can I get an extension versus can I get help? Right? If you ask for an extension, I'm probably saying no because I'm thinking of like all the things that pop up are my teacher meanness program. Students are liars. Students want to cheat. That's what comes up when you hear the word extension. Like extension isn't usually a positive word in our world. But if I hear help, I think, oh, college is tough. Being a young person is tough. Like growing up is tough. Living through a pandemic is tough, right? Like I'm like, oh yeah, I'll definitely help you. I also think like I'm not a jerk. Like if somebody asks me for help, like I'm gonna help them most of the time. That's kind of who I am. That's who most of us are. But if I ask for an extension or a favor, I'm not gonna get it. So if you need someone to help you move, don't ask them for a favor. Be like, can I get help? Right? Don't ask for a favor. Say, can I get help? Boom. Then I'm going to activate helping programs. This is the scary part of this research. People are walking computer programs. That's what I'm seeing here. And guess what? They're not always the same way. I can put a code into that computer and I can make that person act and think in a specific way. Now, this is not being applied by most humans. This is being applied by our culture. And it's not that our culture controls our thoughts all the time. If it did, we'd never switch or change cultures. What's happening is when I'm using a cultural tool like a word, my thoughts are being controlled. Isn't that cool? Yes, it is. And then in sum, both Brazilian, Portuguese, and English speakers perform better on the think question when asked first about where the character would look for an object than when they asked first about where the character thought the object was. Still, they did no better on the look for question itself, depending on its order. The benefit of I'm not even reading that. We're good. Explanations. Let's hear them explain themselves. We coded all the responses to question 3, the request for explanations of experimenter or character behavior given by the 118 children who participated in comparison 1, whether or not they were later dropped from the statistical analyses. Some of the data from one Puerto Rican Spanish speaker were lost, resulting in 469 total responses. Unsurprisingly, more than 1/3 of the responses were irrelevant. Kids be kids. And another 29% were coded as either action, perception, or reality. So 3 and 4-year-olds gave equal numbers of desired explanations. Fewer than 20% of all responses fell into the 3 coding categories that were most indicative of belief or knowledge understanding, and 70% of these were produced by 4-year-olds. Importantly, only 3 such. Here's what we're learning here. Question 3 doesn't matter. We're good. It's done. You've heard my discussion. I'd summarize it in one word. One basic phrase, not one word, one sentence. Language controls our thoughts when we use it. It does not control our thoughts or pattern them all the time, period. In this cross-linguistic study, we addressed the question of whether speakers of languages with explicit false belief markings would be advantaged on false belief tasks over children speaking languages without such markings. Our findings consistently point to a local advantage for speakers of marked languages. Local advantage means humans' thought processes are controlled by the languages that we get them to use. The language holds the intelligence. The language holds the cognitive structure, at least the start sign for the cognitive structure. And the language serves as a start sign for the cognitive structure. So in terms of the interface, there's a shared meaning system that has words. Those words, when used by the human, activate thought processes that exist in one's mind. And the exist in one's mind piece is when you go back and look at that data and you see that 3-year-olds across the board sucked and it was 4-year-olds who were being helped out by the language, right? Like, that's why I said that statement, because, if you don't have the process in your mind, then language isn't going to help you pull it up. You have to have developed it first, and then you can engage in it. So I do wish, I'm probably done. I'm done reading this discussion. You can read it. I normally don't read discussions anyways. I don't care what they're saying right now. To me too, that response is stronger when people just kind of mess things up. And these researchers messed up a beautiful interpretation. I hope they never see this video, but I strongly disagree with how they wrote this study up. I strongly disagree with their methods. I strongly disagree with how they excluded people. But when I look at that raw data, the only thing I agree with, right, I agree with this right here. The pattern I see is clear. One, they didn't get enough participants to test it. That's fine. But you can see 3-year-olds are horrible all over the place. Not horrible individuals, but they're horrible at this task. It's only in these groups right here of 4-year-olds where the marked language is providing a drastic increase. You got 2 as the baseline. This is almost 100% increase. It's like an 80% increase. 2 is the baseline. You got a 60% increase on the think questions. The look questions, you're not finding any difference, right? In the 4-year-olds, they have the ability, but the look questions are showing almost no difference at all. Look at that. All those numbers are basically the same. These numbers are drastically different. You can see that. They differ by over 1 point. These numbers right here, you see they differ by like 0.25 of a point. These differ by 0.25 of a point. These differ by, this is just first and second, so you see an increase there, but by 0.6. So maybe there's something going on in the Brazilian Portuguese group, but not much, right? They do have when they talk about their word, there's something special going on with look. So keep that in mind too. So they do see that. And we're in the look condition here. Down here, we see this 2.93, 2.669. They're basically the same. Ultimately, when you look at the data and don't really believe their crappy analysis, you can see it. You can see what the pattern really is. Their interpretations are just frankly wrong. And the reason why they couldn't make the interpretations we're making is they don't have enough sample size to find a significant p-value. And so now, I'm thinking about the interface between human and culture, the paper you have to write. And I don't know how to put it into words, but I see that the languages that we use that are created by the cultures, that are common in the cultures, activate in us thought processes that exist but are normally not activated. So, You have this process, you use this language term, you're better at this process becomes activated. The language itself serves as a form, an on-off switch. Turn this process on, turn this process off. The language itself, which was created by culture, is one of the interfaces that gets us to do the bidding of the culture. If our language used words like, had different words like, oh, this person's emotions are really strong today. If we had different words for that we could just use one word, we'd be able to activate a process that focuses us on their emotions. Right now we have processes that focus us on their thoughts. We have words that focus us on their thoughts, but there's other words as well. We have words, like I said earlier, that focus us on genders. We have, when we're using these words in Polish, we'll probably be more sexist when we're using last names and first names, maybe. If we can find first names that are gender neutral in Polish, which I'd have to look into. But ultimately, what's going on here is that for those kids who have passed that threshold of theory of mind, when they get a word in their language that primes and that activates theory of mind processes, they do better at theory of mind tasks because the language in it is a start button that activates processes that we have. And this is how language controls our thoughts. And this is one process of how culture can activate our thoughts. We have the capacities in us as humans because we hit that threshold. The culture itself gives us a tool that activates the process that causes us to think like the culture wants us to in that moment. That is the end.